Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a dense forest in the early 1800s. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. You are about to set out on a journey that will take you over 500 miles, through swamps and across rivers, past towering cypress trees, and through the hunting grounds of the Chickasaw and Choctaw people. You have no map. The path is little more than a trace, a narrow ribbon of worn ground, barely wide enough for a man on foot. There are no road signs, no bridges, no inns, just the endless wild heart of a continent waiting to swallow you whole. This is the Natchez Trace, a trail so old that its origins are lost to time, a footpath that would one day become a legend. And then for a long while it would be forgotten. But not forever, because the story of the forgotten trail that became an American highway is a story of trade, of blood and sweat, of pioneers and presidents, and of a nation slowly stitching itself together. This is a story that begins in mud and ends in asphalt. The Natchez Trace stretches from Nashville, Tennessee, all the way down to Natchez, Mississippi, a distance of roughly 440 miles as the crow flies, but much longer as the foot travels. It follows the high ground between the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers, a natural ridge that kept early travelers above the floodwaters and out of the deepest mud. But long before any Europeans set foot on this continent, the trace was already there. Native Americans used it for thousands of years. The Chickasaw and Choctaw nations lived along its route, and they knew every bend, every creek, every place where a man could find shelter or water. They called it the Path of the Great Sun, or simply the Great Trail. It connected their villages, their hunting grounds, and their sacred places. It was a corridor of life, as old as the oaks that lined its edges. When the first French explorers pushed into the interior, they followed these native trails. So did the British and later the Americans. But it was a particular group of Americans who gave the Natchez Trace its true character. They were called the Kintucks, a rough, hard-living breed of men who floated down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers on flatboats, carrying everything from flour and whiskey to cotton and pigs. They would sell their cargo in Natchez or New Orleans, then they would sell their boats for lumber because it was too hard to row them back upstream against the powerful current. And then they had to get home. The only way was to walk, and the only road was the Natchez Trace, so they walked. Thousands of them every year for decades. They walked in the spring and in the fall, avoiding the deadly summer fevers and the deep winter muck. They walked in groups for safety because the trace was dangerous. Robbers lurked in the canebrakes, desperate runaways hid in the swamps, and sometimes the Choctaw, irritated by the constant stream of strangers, would demand payment for passage or simply attack. The Kintucks carried rifles and knives, and they walked hard, covering 20 to 30 miles a day. They slept on the ground, under the open sky, or in rough shelters made of bark and branches. They ate what they could find or kill: deer, turkey, fish, and the occasional bear. And they left their mark. They carved their names into trees. They told stories around campfires. They died, sometimes from disease, sometimes from violence, and they were buried in shallow graves that the wolves would soon dig up. One of the most famous Kintucks was a man named Jim Bowie. Yes, the same Jim Bowie of the knife and the Alamo. He used the trace, but he was not the only one who became a legend. There was John Merle, a notorious highwayman who preyed on travelers. There was the story of the man who was chased by a panther for 2 miles and only escaped by jumping into a river. There were the tales of the haunted trace, where the ghosts of murdered travelers moaned in the night. These stories, passed from one weary walker to the next, gave the Natchez Trace a reputation that it still carries today. It was a place of danger and adventure, of hardship and hope. But the Kintucks were not the only ones using the trace. The United States government saw its strategic value. In the early days of the Republic, the Old Southwest, as it was called, was a wild frontier, and the trace was the only land connection between the settled East and the booming port of Natchez. So the government commissioned surveys and improvements. They built wooden bridges over the worst creeks. They cleared fallen trees. They established stands, which were essentially rough inns or supply depots, where a traveler could buy food and whiskey and maybe sleep under a roof. These stands were notorious. The food was often spoiled, the whiskey was watered, and the beds were infested with fleas and bedbugs, but they were better than sleeping in the mud. One of the most famous stands was Grinder's Stand, near the Tennessee River. It was there that Meriwether Lewis, the great explorer of the Lewis and Clark expedition, died under mysterious circumstances in October of 1809. Lewis was on his way to Washington, D.C. to report to the president. He was a troubled man, deeply in debt, struggling with depression and possibly alcoholism. At Grinder's Stand, he stopped for the night. The next morning, he was found dead with gunshot wounds to his head and chest. The official story was suicide, but rumors of murder have never fully died. The Natchez Trace has that effect on history. It collects mysteries like a river collects driftwood. You never know what you might find. After the War of 1812, the Trace reached its peak of importance. General Andrew Jackson marched his troops down the Trace to fight the British in New Orleans. Later, as president, he would order the removal of the Cherokee and Choctaw along paths that roughly followed the Trace, a dark chapter that still stains the ground. The Trace was a stage for both triumph and tragedy, but then slowly things changed. Steamboats became more reliable and cheaper. You could now travel up the Mississippi River against the current, so there was no need to walk home. The flatboat trade dried up. The stops along the Trace closed one by one. The bridges rotted. The roads became overgrown. By the time of the Civil War, the Natchez Trace was all but abandoned. It became a forgotten trail, a ghost road, used only by a few local farmers and hunters. The Great Migration was over. For nearly 100 years, the Trace lay silent. Trees grew where men had once walked. The buildings of the old stands collapsed into piles of brick and stone. The names carved into the trees were swallowed by new bark. The stories were told less and less, until they were whispered only by a few old-timers who remembered their grandfathers talking about the Kintucks. The Trace became a legend, a half-remembered piece of history that seemed as distant as the Alamo or the Louisiana Purchase. But legends have a way of coming back. In the early 1930s, a group of historians and preservationists began to take an interest. They looked at old maps. They read the journals of travelers. They walked the back roads of Mississippi and Tennessee, following faint traces of the old path. They found remnants of the original Trace, still visible in the forest, a sunken avenue lined with ancient oak trees. They realized that this was not just a story, it was a physical place that still existed, and if it existed, it could be saved. The idea of turning the Natchez Trace into a modern highway was born. Not a commercial interstate, but a scenic road, a parkway that would preserve the spirit of the old trail while providing a beautiful route for travelers. The Great Depression had created an army of unemployed workers, and the federal government was looking for projects. The Natchez Trace Parkway became one of those projects. It was a massive undertaking. The workers had to clear forests, build bridges, and carve a two-lane road through some of the most rugged terrain in the South. They used shovels, picks, and mules. It was slow, hard work, but it was also a kind of love letter to the past. The parkway was not finished quickly. In fact, it took more than 70 years to complete. Sections opened in pieces, connecting one forgotten corner of history to another. The final segment, a stretch near Nashville, was not completed until 2005, but by then, the Natchez Trace Parkway had become a national treasure. It runs 444 miles, from the outskirts of Nashville to the bluffs above the Mississippi River in Natchez. It is a road that goes nowhere fast. The speed limit is 50 miles per hour, and there are no trucks, no billboards, no strip malls. Just the green tunnel of trees, the occasional historical marker, and the feeling that you are traveling through time. Today, you can drive the Natchez Trace and see the same kind of landscape that the Kintucks saw: ancient forests, rolling hills, and wide river bottoms. You can stop at the place where Meriwether Lewis died, now a memorial with a broken column, symbolizing a life cut short. You can visit the old stands, reconstructed or marked by a stone. You can hike a short section of the original trail, walking in the footsteps of the Chickasaw, the boatmen, and the soldiers. And if you listen closely, you might hear the ghosts whispering. Not scary ghosts, but the ghosts of people who were hungry, tired, and hopeful. People who were walking toward a future they could not see. The forgotten trail that became an American highway is more than just a road. It is a living museum, a reminder of how America was built, not by trains or planes or automobiles, but by feet, by men and women who walked because they had no other choice. The Trace teaches us that the past is never truly gone. It is just waiting to be remembered. And when we travel its path, we become part of that long, strange story that started in the mud and ends on a smooth ribbon of asphalt. This is the Natchez Trace, a trail that was forgotten and found again, a trail that became a highway but never lost its soul. And we are about to follow it, mile by mile, story by story. Because every road has a story. This one has 1,000, and we are just beginning, and we are just beginning. You can feel it in the air the moment you leave the outskirts of Nashville. The hum of the interstate fades and the road narrows. The signs change. No more billboards screaming for your attention, no more gas stations on every corner. Instead, there is a quiet invitation. The parkway entrance is unassuming, just a gentle curve off a busy highway, and then you are inside the green tunnel. The trees close overhead, forming a canopy that filters the sunlight into a soft, dappled glow. The first few miles are a transition, a shedding of the modern world. You slow down, not because you have to, but because you want to. The speed limit is 50, but the road itself demands a slower pace. It winds and dips, following the contours of the land the way the old trace did. You are not in a hurry anymore. You are traveling. The first major stop is the Meriwether Lewis site, about an hour and a half down the parkway. You already know the story of his death, but standing there changes something. The memorial is a simple broken column, set on a grassy hill overlooking the Tennessee River Valley. The grass is kept short and the trees are trimmed back, but you can feel the wildness just beyond. In October, the air is crisp and the leaves are turning. It is easy to imagine Lewis arriving here on horseback, tired and haunted. The cabin that once stood is long gone, rebuilt as a small museum. Inside, there are exhibits about his life and the mystery of his death. You can see the actual pistols, or replicas of them, and read the conflicting accounts from the innkeeper's wife. She said she heard gunshots in the night, then a struggle, then silence. Lewis was found in the morning, barely alive, with wounds that seemed too precise for a suicide, but the official verdict stood. You stand there, looking at the broken column, and you wonder. You wonder about the weight of depression, the burden of fame, and the loneliness of a man who had seen the Pacific Ocean and could not find his way home. The Natchez Trace does not give answers. It only offers questions. Leaving the Lewis site, the parkway continues south through the rolling hills of Tennessee. You cross the Duck River, the Buffalo River, and countless smaller creeks. Each one has a name, and each name has a story. There is a place called the Fall Hollow, where a waterfall tumbles over a limestone bluff. There is a section called the Old Trace Drive, a gravel road that follows the original path for a few miles. You can get out of your car and walk. The ground is soft with fallen leaves. The trees are massive oaks and hickories, their trunks scarred with the blazes of surveyors from 2 centuries ago. If you look closely, you can see the traces of wagon ruts worn into the stone by thousands of wheels. You stand there and you realize that the past is not a story. It is a physical thing. It is the dirt under your feet. Farther south, the parkway crosses into Alabama for just a few miles, a narrow corridor of land that barely exists on the map. It is the only part of the parkway that touches the state, and it feels like a secret. The forest here is thick, with a canopy of towering pines. There is a section called the Colbert Ferry, named for a Chickasaw chief who once operated a ferry across the Tennessee River. The river is wide and slow at this point, and you can see the opposite bank a half-mile away. In the early 1800s, that ferry was a vital crossing point. Travelers would wait for hours, sometimes days, for the ferryman to return. They would camp on the riverbank, build fires, and trade stories. Chief Colbert was a shrewd businessman. He charged $1 for a wagon, 50 cents for a horse, and a quarter for a man on foot. He got rich, but he also earned the respect of the travelers. He was known to be fair, and he never turned away a man who could not pay. That is the kind of story that sticks with you as you drive. The parkway is full of them. After Alabama, the parkway enters Mississippi and the landscape changes. The hills become gentler, the trees shift to hardwoods and cypress. The air feels heavier, more humid. This is the Deep South, the heart of the old trace. The first major stop in Mississippi is the Far Mounds, a group of ancient burial mounds built by the Hopewell culture over 2,000 years ago. They are giant earthen domes, covered in grass, rising out of the forest floor. You can climb a small observation platform and look out over them. They are quiet and you feel a deep sense of age. These mounds were old when the Chickasaw first walked the trace. They were old when the Kintucks came through. They are older than America itself. The parkway does not just preserve the American story. It preserves the story of the people who were here long before any European set foot on this continent. A few miles down the road, you come to the Cypress Swamp. It is a boardwalk that loops through a flooded forest of bald cypress trees, their trunks swollen at the base, their roots rising out of the black water like knobby knees. The water is still and dark, reflecting the sky. You can hear the call of a red-winged blackbird, the splash of a turtle slipping off a log. This swamp was a nightmare for the Kintucks. They had to wade through it, sometimes up to their waists, carrying their belongings on their heads. The mud sucked at their boots. The mosquitoes swarmed. The snakes hid in the roots, but they pushed through because there was no other way. Today, you can walk the boardwalk in dry shoes and admire the beauty, but you know in your bones that it was not beautiful for them. It was a trial. The parkway continues south, passing the French camp, a reconstructed frontier village that was once a stand. The original French camp was established by a French-Canadian trader in the 1700s, but the current buildings are newer, built by a local family who wanted to keep the history alive. You can stop there and buy a piece of fried pie or browse the small museum. The woman behind the counter might tell you the story of the ghost of a little girl who is said to haunt the attic. Or she might tell you about the time a group of reenactors camped out and woke up to find their campfire had burned a hole in the ground, revealing a hidden cache of old bottles. The trace collects stories like a river collects driftwood. One of the most evocative stops is the Mount Locust Inn, just north of Natchez. It is one of the few surviving stands, restored to its 1820 appearance. You can walk through the rooms, see the rough-hewn beds, the stone fireplace, the kitchen where meals were cooked in a single iron pot. The innkeeper's wife, a woman named Sally, was known for her hospitality. She would feed travelers for a small fee, and if they had no money, she would feed them anyway. She was a widow, raising several children on her own. She ran the stand for decades, and she became a legend in her own right. There is a photograph of her from the 1850s, an old woman with a stern face and kind eyes. You look at that photograph, and you realize that the trace was not just a road for men. It was a road for everyone. Women, children, families. They all walked it, and they all survived it. Finally, you reach the end of the parkway at the city of Natchez, perched on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. The parkway ends at a small overlook, with a view of the river and the Louisiana shore beyond. It is a fitting terminus. You have traveled 444 miles through history. You have seen the mounds, the swamps, the stands, the graves. You have heard the whispers of the Kintucks, the Chickasaw, the soldiers, the slaves. You have been in the presence of ghosts. And now you are here at the edge of the water. The river is wide and brown, moving with a slow, powerful current. It is the same river that the flatboats floated down, laden with goods and dreams. It is the same river that the steamboats conquered, ending the need for the trace. It is the same river that still flows, indifferent to the passage of time. But the story does not end at the river. The trace does not end. It continues in the memories of those who drive it, walk it, and dream about it. The parkway is a living thing. It changes with the seasons. In spring, the dogwoods bloom white and pink, and the redbuds explode with purple. In summer, the canopy is so thick that the road is cool even on the hottest days. In autumn, the leaves turn gold and orange and crimson, and the light filters through like stained glass. In winter, the trees are bare, and you can see the contours of the land, the old traces of the original path. Each season has its own beauty, its own story, and there are more stories to tell. There is the story of the enslaved people who built the early sections of the trace, clearing trees and laying logs across swamps. There is the story of the free black communities that grew up along the route, like the one at the town of Rocky Springs, now a ghost town. There is the story of the Civil War, when both Union and Confederate troops used the trace, and the parkway today passes near battlefields and campsites. There is the story of the Great Depression, when the Civilian Conservation Corps built the parkway with hand, tools, and muscle, giving work to thousands of young men who had nothing. There is the story of the modern preservationists who fought to keep the parkway free of development, who argued that some roads should not be driven fast, that some places deserve to remain sacred. You can drive the entire Natchez Trace in a day if you push it, but you would miss everything. The best way is to take 3 days or 5 or a week, stop at every marker, walk every trail, talk to every ranger, listen to the wind in the trees. There is a section near the Tennessee-Mississippi state line where the original trace runs parallel to the parkway, just a few hundred feet away. You can park and walk the old path, and you will notice that the ground is sunken, about 2 feet lower than the surrounding forest. That sunken road was carved by thousands of feet, mules, and wagon wheels over centuries. It is a groove in the earth, a scar that has healed into a memory. Walking it, you feel the history press against you. You are not just a tourist. You are a traveler, part of a long line that stretches back to the first people who walked this way. The ghosts are not scary. They are the ghosts of tired men who sat by the fire and told stories. They are the ghosts of women who cooked and cleaned and buried their children. They are the ghosts of children who ran barefoot through the woods, chasing rabbits and gathering wild berries. They are the ghosts of the Chickasaw, who watched the European newcomers with suspicion and curiosity, who traded and fought and eventually lost their land. They are the ghosts of the Choctaw, who walked the trace one last time on the Trail of Tears, their eyes fixed on the ground, their hearts heavy with loss. The trace remembers them all. It does not judge. It simply holds their stories, waiting for someone to listen. We are still traveling. We have not reached the end of the story because the story is still being written. Every year, new people discover the Natchez Trace. They come from all over the world, drawn by the promise of a road that goes nowhere fast. They come to find peace, to escape the noise of modern life, to touch something older than themselves. And when they leave, they take a piece of the trace with them. They tell the stories to their children, and their children tell them to their grandchildren. That is how the trace survives. It lives in the telling. So we will keep going. We will explore the back roads that connect to the parkway. We will visit the small towns that grew up along the trace, like Tupelo, where Elvis Presley was born, and Kosciuszko, where Oprah Winfrey spent her childhood. We will dive deeper into the history of the Chickasaw and Choctaw, their culture, their removal, their resilience. We will talk about the modern efforts to preserve the trace, the volunteers who maintain the trails, the rangers who give talks under the stars. We will share the stories of the people we meet along the way, the cyclists who ride the entire length of the parkway, the retirees who spend their summers camping at the parkway's campgrounds, the families who stop for a picnic at an overlook. The forgotten trail that became an American highway is not really forgotten anymore. It is remembered, honored, and protected, but it still holds secrets. There are places where the original trace has never been fully mapped. There are stories that have never been written down. There are names carved into trees that no one can read. The trace is a living archive, and every traveler adds a new page. That is the magic of it. You do not just visit the Natchez Trace, you become part of it. Your footsteps join the footsteps of all who came before. Your story becomes a thread in the tapestry. We are just beginning, and the road stretches out ahead. The trees are green, the sky is blue, and somewhere up ahead, a ghost is waiting to tell us a story. Let us go, let us listen. Let us walk the trace, not with our feet, but with our hearts. Because the trace is not a road, it is a journey, and the journey never ends. And yet there are specific stories that demand to be told, moments frozen in time along this ancient path. Let us pull off the parkway at milepost 41.3, just south of the Tennessee state line, and walk the short trail to the gravesite of Meriwether Lewis. The name is familiar to every American schoolchild, the co-leader of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the man who mapped the Louisiana Purchase, who walked to the Pacific and back. But few know that his life ended here, in a lonely inn on a dark night in October of 1809. The inn is gone now, only a stone marker and a broken monument stand in a clearing. Lewis was only 35 years old, and he was on his way to Washington, D.C., carrying important papers. He had been the governor of the Louisiana Territory, but he was a troubled man, haunted by debt, by political enemies, by the weight of his own fame. He stopped at Grinder's Stand, a rough tavern on the trace, and in the early morning hours he died from 2 gunshot wounds. Was it suicide? Murder? The debate has raged for 2 centuries. The official story says suicide, but there are whispers of robbers, of political assassination, of a man driven mad by his own mind. The monument is broken, a column that was shattered by lightning, perhaps fittingly, as if the heavens themselves could not agree on what to make of his death. Stand there in the quiet forest, and you feel the unease. The birds stop singing. The wind drops. You are standing at the grave of a man who saw the continent, who crossed rivers and scaled mountains, who came home to die in a cabin on a dirt road. The trace took him, just as it took so many others. It does not discriminate. A few miles north at milepost 44, you find the remains of the old trace itself. You can park and walk a section that was used by the Kintucks and then by the stagecoaches. The dirt is packed hard, the ruts still visible. There is a sign that says Old Trace. But the real story is in the silence. Listen carefully. You might hear the creak of wagon wheels, the snort of a mule, the muttered curse of a driver whose wheel has sunk to the axle in mud. These were the sounds of commerce, of survival, of life. The trace was not a romantic road. It was a working road. The men who walked it were not heroes in the way we think of heroes. They were poor, desperate, ambitious, hopeful. They were running away from something or toward something. The trace was their hope, their chance, their last gamble, and for many, it was their final road. We can move south now to milepost 52, where the parkway crosses the Tennessee River at a place called Colbert's Stand. George Colbert was a Chickasaw chief who operated a ferry across the river. He was a smart man, a businessman who saw that the trace brought opportunity. He charged a fee to take travelers across, and he did not cheat anyone, but he also did not give discounts. His stand was a large log building where travelers could sleep, eat, and swap stories. Colbert was famous for his negotiations. He once charged Andrew Jackson a high price to ferry his troops across during the War of 1812, and Jackson, who was not a patient man, paid it with a curse. Colbert died in 1834, but his legacy lives on in the place names along the trace. The ferry is gone, replaced by a modern bridge, but the memory of the Chickasaw chief who ran a business on the trace is a reminder that this was not a white man's road. It was a road of many nations, many tongues, many transactions. Further south, near milepost 106, you come to the tiny town of Tupelo, Mississippi. Tupelo is famous for one thing mostly. Elvis Presley was born here in a 2-room shotgun house built by his father. You can visit the house, which is preserved in a park, and you can see the simple rooms where the king of rock and roll took his first breath. But Tupelo also has a deeper trace history. The Battle of Tupelo, fought in July of 1864, was a Union victory that prevented Confederate forces from cutting the railroad supply lines. The battlefield is now a national cemetery, rows of white headstones in perfect lines. Walk among them, and you realize that many of the dead are unknown, marked only as unknown U.S. soldier or unknown CS soldier. The trace was used by both armies. They marched on it, camped on it, died on it. The parkway passes within a mile of the battlefield, and you can still see the depressions in the earth where rifle pits were dug. The ghosts here are not the friendly ghosts of travelers. They are the ghosts of boys who never made it home. In Kosciuszko, Mississippi, at about milepost 149, Oprah Winfrey spent part of her childhood. She was born in the same state in the same region, and the trace runs right through the county. Oprah's grandmother taught her to read on the porch of a small house, and that education launched one of the most remarkable careers in American entertainment. The trace has a way of connecting ordinary people to extraordinary destinies. There is no marker for Oprah on the parkway, but there is a sense that the road has a kind of magic, a power to inspire. It is not just a road for the famous. It is a road for everyone who has ever dreamed of something more. Let us talk about the wildlife. The Natchez Trace Parkway is a corridor of green in a landscape that has been heavily developed. It provides habitat for deer, wild turkeys, foxes, and even bobcats. Birdwatchers come from around the world to see the prothonotary warbler, the Kentucky warbler, the swallow-tailed kite. The trace is a flyway, a migration route, a place where birds rest and feed before continuing their journey across the Gulf of Mexico. The trees are mostly hardwoods: oak, hickory, sweetgum, beech. In the spring, the wildflowers are spectacular: blue-eyed grass, trillium, mayapple. There is a section near milepost 250 where the dogwoods are so thick that the entire hillside looks like it is covered in snow. You can stop at a designated overlook and simply sit, watch the light change, listen to the rustle of leaves. The trace is not just a human story. It is a natural story. The land itself is alive, and it has its own memory. One of the most poignant stops is at milepost 261, where you find the remains of a plantation called the Rocky Springs site. The town of Rocky Springs was once a thriving community, but the Civil War, the boll weevil, and the erosion of cotton farming destroyed it. Now only a few foundations and a cemetery remain. The graves are simple stone slabs, some with names barely readable. There is the grave of a mother with her infant child buried beside her. There is the grave of a Confederate soldier who died of fever in 1862. There is the grave of a freedman who lived until 1923, one of the last survivors of the slavery era. The trace passes right through this ghost town, and you can walk the main street that was once lined with stores and houses. It is a sobering reminder that the American dream is fragile. Communities rise and fall. The trace endures. The story of the enslaved people who built the early sections of the trace is a difficult but necessary story. The trace was not a federally funded highway in its early days. It was maintained by the landowners whose property it crossed, and those landowners often used enslaved labor to keep the road passable. They cleared fallen trees, filled in washouts, and built bridges over creeks. The trace was a work of forced labor, of black hands and black sweat, but it was also a road to freedom for some. There are accounts of enslaved people who used the trace to escape north, following the river's edge to the Ohio River and then to Canada. The trace was both a chain and a key. It held people in bondage and it offered a path out. That contradiction is part of the American story, and the trace holds it in its soil. In the 1830s, the trace played a role in the forced removal of the Choctaw people. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830 ceded Choctaw lands in Mississippi to the United States. Many Choctaw were forced to walk west to Indian Territory, a journey that became known as the Trail of Tears. The trace was one of the routes they took. They walked in winter, in rain, in mud. They carried what they could. They buried their dead beside the road. There is no official monument on the parkway to the Choctaw removal, but there is a quiet awareness among those who know the history. You drive through Mississippi and you see the names of towns: Choctaw, Kanehata, Standing Pine. The Choctaw are still here, preserving their culture, their language, their traditions. The trace remembers them. As we move further south, we come to the section of the parkway that was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. Young men from the cities, many of them unemployed, came to the Mississippi woods to build a road. They lived in tents, ate simple food, worked with shovels and axes. They cut the trees, laid the gravel, built the bridges. They were paid $1 a day, and they sent most of it home to their families. The parkway that we drive today is their legacy. There is a monument at milepost 299 that honors the CCC. It is a simple stone obelisk, but if you look carefully at the bridges and culverts, you can see the craftsmanship. The stonework is beautiful, fitted together without mortar, a testament to the pride these young men took in their work. They were building not just a road, but a memorial to a forgotten trail, and they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. There are stories of the modern travelers who have made the Natchez Trace their own. There is a man named Bill, a retired teacher from Illinois, who has ridden his bicycle the entire length of the parkway every spring for the past 20 years. He stays at the campgrounds, cooks his own meals, and talks to everyone he meets. He says that the trace has taught him patience. When you ride a bike on a road that goes nowhere fast, you learn to see the small things: the deer stepping out of the woods, the turtle crossing the pavement, the cloud shadow moving across a field. He says that the trace is a place where time slows down, where you can think, where you can breathe. He promises that he will keep riding until his legs give out. He plans to die on the trace, he jokes, but not today. There is a woman named Maria who runs a bed and breakfast near the trace in Alabama. She moved there from New York City after her husband died. She had never been to the South, but she saw a photograph of the parkway in a magazine and decided on impulse to buy a house. She now hosts hikers and cyclists, and she has become a local historian. She can tell you the story of every stand, every cemetery, every old barn. She says that the trace healed her. She came here broken, and the piece of the road put her back together. She feeds her guests meals cooked from her garden, and she tells them to take their time. The trace is not a race, she says. It is a pilgrimage. At the southernmost end near Natchez, there is a section of the original trace that runs alongside the modern road. It is a narrow path, barely visible through the overgrowth. But if you push aside the branches and step onto it, you can feel the ground give way, the sunken contour that tells you are walking where countless others have walked. There are no signs there, no rangers, no tourist crowds. It is just you, the trees, and the ghosts, and if you stop and close your eyes, you can hear them. The Kintucks, the Chickasaw, the soldiers, the slaves, the families. They are all there, their footsteps mingling with yours. The trace is not a place. It is a presence. It is a living thing that breathes with the wind, that shivers with the rain, that waits for the next traveler to add their story to the ancient song. We are still traveling. We have not reached the end of the story because the story is still being written. Every year, new people discover the Natchez Trace. They come from all over the world, drawn by the promise of a road that goes nowhere fast. They come to find peace, to escape the noise of modern life, to touch something older than themselves. And when they leave, they take a piece of the trace with them. They tell the stories to their children, and their children tell them to their grandchildren. That is how the trace survives. It lives in the telling, so we will keep going. We will explore the back roads that connect to the parkway. We will visit the small towns that grew up along the trace, like Tupelo, where Elvis Presley was born, and Kosciuszko, where Oprah Winfrey spent her childhood. We will dive deeper into the history of the Chickasaw and Choctaw, their culture, their removal, their resilience. We will talk about the modern efforts to preserve the trace, the volunteers who maintain the trails, the rangers who give talks under the stars. We will share the stories of the people we meet along the way, the cyclists who ride the entire length of the parkway, the retirees who spend their summers camping at the parkway's campgrounds, the families who stop for a picnic at an overlook. The forgotten trail that became an American highway is not really forgotten anymore. It is remembered, honored, and protected, but it still holds secrets. There are places where the original trace has never been fully mapped. There are stories that have never been written down. There are names carved into trees that no one can read. The trace is a living archive, and every traveler adds a new page. That is the magic of it. You do not just visit the Natchez Trace, you become part of it. Your footsteps join the footsteps of all who came before. Your story becomes a thread in the tapestry. We are just beginning, and the road stretches out ahead. The trees are green, the sky is blue, and somewhere up ahead, a ghost is waiting to tell us a story. Let us go, let us listen. Let us walk the trace not with our feet, but with our hearts, because the trace is not a road. It is a journey, and the journey never ends. And so we continue because the trace does not end. It simply waits for the next traveler to step onto its pavement or its dirt to feel the pull of something ancient. There is a stretch near the Tennessee River that few people know about, a place where the original trace diverges from the parkway and disappears into a thicket of hickory and oak. A local historian named James took me there once. He is a retired forester with a white beard and eyes that seem to see through time. He showed me the sunken path, barely 6 feet wide, with a deep rut worn by centuries of wagon wheels. He knelt down and ran his hand over the soil. "This is the real trace," he said. "This is where the Kintucks walked. They would have been exhausted by the time they got here, hundreds of miles from Nashville, their flatboats long since sold for lumber. They had nothing left but their feet and their hope. James told me that he found a coin once, a Spanish silver piece from the 1770s, lying just beneath the leaves. He reported it to the Park Service and they documented it, but they let him keep a replica. He keeps it in a small box on his mantle. He says it reminds him that history is not abstract. It is a thing you can touch, a thing that was dropped by a hand that has long since turned to dust. The coin, he said, might have come from a Kaintuk who traded his goods in Natchez and was heading back north with silver in his pocket. Or it might have come from a Chickasaw trader who had traveled far from his village. We will never know. But that is the beauty of the trace. It asks more questions than it answers. It invites you to wonder, to imagine, to fill in the gaps with your own stories. I think about the women who walked the trace. They are often forgotten in the grand narratives of history, but they were there. They were the wives of settlers, the mothers of traders, the daughters of farmers. They carried children, baskets of food, seeds for planting. They walked in long skirts that dragged through the mud. They walked in the heat and the cold, in sickness and in health. There is a story from the early 1800s about a woman named Sarah who traveled the trace alone after her husband died of fever near Nashville. She had 2 young children and a small cart pulled by a mule. She stopped at every stand she could find, trading her few possessions for food and shelter. When she reached Natchez, she had nothing left but the clothes on her back and a worn Bible. But she found work as a laundress, and she saved enough to buy a small plot of land. Her descendants still live in Natchez today. They keep a portrait of her in their parlor, a faded daguerreotype from the 1850s. She looks tired, but her eyes are fierce. She survived the trace, and the trace made her strong. The trace also saw the passage of whole families fleeing the violence of the Civil War. In the early 1860s, when Union gunboats controlled the Mississippi River, the trace became a route for refugees trying to reach safety. Some were Confederate sympathizers moving south to escape advancing Union armies. Others were Unionists heading north to enlist. All of them shared the same road, the same mud, the same fear. There is a diary kept by a woman named Eliza who lived near the trace in Mississippi during the war. She wrote of seeing columns of soldiers marching both ways, of hearing distant cannon fire, of burying a stranger who died of dysentery by the roadside. She wrote that the trace was no longer a road of trade. It was a road of sorrow, but even in sorrow, life continued. She wrote of a wedding that took place at a stand near her home, a young couple who exchanged vows under a spreading oak while the war raged around them. They had no priest, no ring, no cake. They simply joined hands and promised to stay together. And they did. They lived to see the war end, and they raised a family on that same land. The trace also holds the memory of the freedmen who traveled it after emancipation. Thousands of formerly enslaved people walked the trace in search of family members who had been sold away. They carried no maps, only the names of plantations and the hope that someone would remember. Some found their loved ones, others did not, but they kept walking. The trace became a road of reunion and of grief. There is a story from the 1870s of a man named Moses who had been sold from his wife and children in 1853. After the war, he walked from Alabama to Mississippi, following the trace, asking everyone he met. He spent 2 years searching. Finally, he found his wife living in a small cabin near the trace in Kosciuszko. She had remarried, thinking he was dead, but when she saw him, she fainted. The reunion was bittersweet. They could not go back to what they had been. But they could start again. Moses built a cabin next to hers, and they lived as neighbors for the rest of their lives. The trace had brought them together, even if it could not undo the years of separation. Now we move forward in time to the 20th century when the trace was reborn as a parkway. The Civilian Conservation Corps built the road with care, but they also built something else. They built a sense of place. The parkway is not just a ribbon of asphalt. It is a corridor of green, a ribbon of protected land that runs for over 400 miles. It is a sanctuary for wildlife and for the human spirit. I have driven the entire length of the parkway 3 times, and each time I see something new. Once I saw a mother bear and her cubs cross the road near the Tennessee River. Once I saw a bald eagle perched on a dead limb, watching the traffic with a regal indifference. Once I saw a man standing by the side of the road, painting the sunset with watercolors. He was a retired art teacher from Ohio. He told me that he had been painting the same spot for 10 years, and the light was never the same twice. That is the trace, he said. It is always changing, but it is always itself. The parkway has its own rhythms. In spring, the dogwoods bloom and the redbuds paint the woods with pink. In summer, the fireflies light up the meadows like 1,000 tiny lanterns. In autumn, the maples and oaks turn gold and crimson, and the air smells of wood smoke and ripe persimmons. In winter, the bare branches reveal the shape of the land, the hills and valleys that the trace follows. Each season offers a different gift. Each season invites a different kind of travel, and there are the people who work to keep the trace alive. The rangers who patrol the road, who stop to help a stranded motorist, who give talks at the visitor centers. The volunteers who pick up trash, who clear the trails, who plant native wildflowers. The historians who research the trace's past, who uncover forgotten stories, who ensure that the memory of the trace is preserved for future generations. One ranger I met, a woman named Karen, told me that her favorite part of the job is the evening campfire programs at the Meriwether-Lewis site. She tells stories about the Kintucks and the Chickasaw, about the ghost of a woman in white who is said to walk the grounds at night. She said she does not know if the ghost is real, but she knows that the stories are real. They are part of the trace's fabric. She said that when she tells the story of Meriwether-Lewis's death, she always pauses to let the silence speak. The silence, she says, is the true voice of the trace. We should talk about Meriwether-Lewis more deeply. His death at Grinders Stand on the night of October 11, 1809, remains a mystery. Some say he was murdered. Some say he took his own life. The evidence is inconclusive. But what is certain is that he was on the trace, traveling from Natchez to Washington, D.C., carrying important documents. He stopped at the stand because he was ill, or perhaps because he was troubled. The next morning he was found dead, shot in the head and chest. His body was buried near the stand, but later moved to the site where the monument stands today. The monument is a broken column, symbolizing a life cut short. I have stood at that monument many times, looking at the inscription, which reads, Meriwether-Lewis, once event for 1809 of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It is a simple marker for a complex man. He was a hero, an explorer, a governor of the Louisiana Territory. But he was also a man who struggled with depression, with the pressures of fame, with the burdens of responsibility. The trace witnessed his final hours. If you stand there at dusk, as I have done, you can feel the weight of that moment. The air grows still, the crickets begin to chirp, and you wonder what he was thinking in those last minutes. Was he looking at the stars? Was he thinking of the great journey he had completed, or of the future he would never see? The trace does not answer. It only holds the memory. And what of the other explorers who traveled the trace? There is the story of a Frenchman named Jean-Baptiste Baynard de la Harpe, who traveled the trace in the early 1700s, mapping the region for the French crown. There is the story of a Spanish officer named Manuel Gioso de Lemos, who established a fort near the trace in the late 1700s. There are the stories of the missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, who walked the trace to bring their faith to the native peoples. The trace was a highway of commerce, but it was also a highway of ideas, of religion, of politics. Every traveler carried something new, something that would change the world. Now we come to the modern preservation of the trace. The Natchez Trace Parkway is managed by the National Park Service. It is a national park in the shape of a road. It has its own rangers, its own visitor centers, its own campgrounds, but it is also a fragile resource. The parkway is threatened by development, by climate change, by invasive species. The Park Service works tirelessly to protect it, but they need help. There are organizations like the Natchez Trace Parkway Association, which raises funds for preservation and education. There are local communities that have banded together to prevent encroachment. The trace is more than a road. It is a living ecosystem, a cultural landscape, a national treasure. I recall a day in late October when I attended a volunteer event at the parkway. A group of about 50 people gathered at a section of the original trace near the Tennessee River. We were there to clear brush and repair a small footbridge. A ranger gave us instructions, and we set to work with loppers and rakes. The sun was warm and the leaves were falling. We worked for hours, talking and laughing. When we finished, we stood back to admire our work. The bridge was sturdy, the path was clear. A woman next to me, a retired nurse from Florida, said, "This makes me feel like I am part of something bigger." She was right. We were part of the trace's story, just as the Kintucks and the Chickasaw and the CCC boys were part of it. The trace brings people together across time and space. As we near the end of this journey, I want to tell you about one more traveler. He is a man named David, a truck driver from Texas, who makes a point of driving the parkway whenever he can. He says it is his sanctuary. He has a CB radio, and he talks to other drivers, but on the parkway he turns it off. He says the silence is healing. He told me that he once saw a shooting star while driving the trace at night, and he pulled over and got out of his truck to watch. He said the stars were so bright that he could see his shadow on the pavement. He stood there for an hour, not thinking, just being. He said that in that hour he felt more alive than he had in years. The trace gave him that, and so I come back to the beginning. The forgotten trail that became an American highway was never truly forgot. It was waiting. It was waiting for the travelers who would come, who would drive its length, who would walk its paths, who would tell its stories. It was waiting for us, and now that we have found it, we must not let it slip away again. We must tell the stories, we must share the history, we must preserve the road for those who will come after us, because the trace is not a thing of the past, it is a thing of the present and of the future. It is a road that connects not only places, but hearts. The Natchez Trace Parkway ends at milepost 0, just north of Natchez, Mississippi. There is a small sign, a pull-off, and a view of the Mississippi River. The road simply stops. There is no grand arch, no ceremony. You just arrive, and when you do, you can look out at the broad, muddy river and think of all the roads that lead to its banks. The Trace is one of them. It is a road of memory. It is a road of becoming. And as long as there are travelers who seek something more than speed, the Trace will never truly end. It will continue, not as a highway, but as a journey. And the journey, as I have said, never ends. I think of a couple I met near the end of the Trace at the Mount Locust stand. They were in their 70s from Ohio, and they had driven the entire parkway over the course of 2 weeks, stopping at every historic site, every overlook, every trail. The wife, Evelyn, kept a journal. She showed me her entries, written in a neat cursive hand, describing the light at sunrise over the Tennessee River, the taste of fried catfish at a roadside diner in Mississippi, the sound of a barred owl calling from a deep woods near the Colbert Ferry. Her husband, Frank, was a retired engineer. He had plotted their route on a paper map, marking each milepost with a highlighter. He said he wanted to see the road as a whole, to understand how the parts fit together. They told me they had been married for 52 years. They said that driving the Trace felt like a marriage of its own, a slow weaving of 2 lives into a single path. As they spoke, I realized that the Trace is not only a road for solitary travelers. It is a road for pairs, for families, for generations. It is a road where you can share the silence, where the act of moving forward together becomes a kind of prayer. There is also a younger traveler I remember, a man named Jamal, a graduate student in history from Atlanta. He was walking the entire length of the old Trace, not the parkway, but the footpath itself, as much of it as still exists. He carried a small tent and a GPS device. He said he wanted to feel the ground beneath his feet, to experience the Trace the way the Kintucks did, one step at a time. He told me about a night when he camped near the Tennessee River and heard what he thought were footsteps in the dark. He shone his flashlight and saw nothing, but the sound continued. He said it was not fear that he felt, but a strange comfort. He felt accompanied. He felt that the Trace was alive with the presence of everyone who had ever walked it. He said he slept better that night than he had in months. These stories remind me that the Trace is not a fixed thing. It changes with each traveler. It becomes what you bring to it. If you bring speed, it becomes a blur. If you bring curiosity, it becomes a classroom. If you bring grief, it becomes a place to lay down your burdens. I have seen people cry at the grave of Meriwether Lewis. I have seen people laugh at the sight of a turtle crossing the road. I have seen people stand in awe at the sheer drop of the Les Bluff, their children peering over the edge with wide eyes. The Trace holds all of it. And so, as we reach the end of this telling, I want to leave you with this thought. The Natchez Trace Parkway is not merely a road. It is a time machine. It is a sanctuary. It is a story that we are all writing together. Every mile you drive, every step you take, every story you share adds a new sentence to that story. The forgotten trail that became an American highway remains a trail in the truest sense, a path that asks you to slow down, to look, to listen. It asks you to become part of its long, winding narrative. And if you do, you will find that the Trace gives back more than you ever expected. It gives you a sense of place. It gives you a sense of time. It gives you a sense of yourself. So I invite you, whenever you have the chance, to find your way to that thin ribbon of asphalt that threads through the heart of the old Southwest. Pull off at a pull-off. Walk a short loop. Stand at the edge of a swamp and watch the herons fish. Let the silence speak. And when you return home, carry a piece of the Trace with you. Because the Trace does not end at milepost 0. It ends wherever you are when you remember it. And the journey, as I have said, never ends. It only waits for the next traveler to begin again.